Hey everyone, welcome back to another gripping tale. Today, we're diving into a world of adventure, betrayal, and the darkest corners of the human heart. This is a story of a young man, a sailor with a promising future, whose world is shattered by tragedy and deceit. Prepare to be transported to the harsh realities of the 19th century, a time of exploration, commerce, and the sinister underbelly of the slave trade. Our protagonist will face unimaginable challenges as he navigates a treacherous path of revenge and redemption. With every twist and turn, you'll find yourself captivated by this epic saga of love, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride. Let's set sail. It's a business. Chapter 1. Prologue. We were having a wonderful evening in the first-class cabin when we felt a faint nudge. She whispered, "Almost." I immediately went back to my occupation. Then there was a knock on the cabin door, and a voice said, "All passengers report to the boat deck. This is an order from the captain." Since my wife and I were wearing nothing but frustrated, frowny faces, I partially opened the door and said, "It's the middle of the night. What the devil does the captain want to see us on the boat deck?" The steward stood in the passage holding a pair of those awful life belts made of sailcloth and cork. He said nonchalantly, "If you like, I'll help you put them on." In desperation, I grabbed the restraints, slammed the door shut, and turned on the light. She had thrown a robe over her beautiful body and was sitting on the edge of the bed. She asked, puzzled, "What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. We have to go up to the lifeboat deck. I can't imagine them doing lifeboat drills at such an ungodly hour, but I guess they are." In the beginning, seabirds soared overhead as we rounded Clark's Point out of Buzzard's Bay. It was a dazzling early summer day, bright blue sky, a few white puffy clouds. The trees were bright green. The waves crashing on the rocky beach added a contrasting frothy hue. The wind was tailwind, and we were making our way on the jib and jib. The Ansel Gibbs was hunting sperm whales in the South Atlantic, and the hold was full. That's a big payday, and I was entitled to a good chunk of it as ship's master. Life was good. It was rare for a 20-year-old to become a harpooner. But I had grown up in New Bedford, where whaling was a religion, and it had been in my blood from an early age. Like most boys, I wanted to be just like my old man. He was the captain of the ship Cicero, a huge guy with fierce blue eyes and a weathered face. I never really knew him. He was away all the time. But I shared his love of adventure. When I was a kid, he gave me a toy harpoon. I think someone carved it out of whalebone. I just had to try it. So one morning, I snuck up on the cat as it was sunning itself by our window. I didn't hurt it much, just poked it in the butt. But my mom remembers me yelling, "Pay up, Mom," she sounds, and the cat, shrieking, ran down the street. By the time I was 14, I was blonde, blue-eyed, and larger than most of the men on my first team. I had my Viking ancestors to thank for that, but I had spent every year since my hair had started to grow on strengthening my back and arm muscles. I knew I had to be stronger than everyone else if I wanted to pull a harpoon paddle. During the 3 voyages, I managed to move from the cockpit to the steering compartment, where the experienced workers slept, and I was only 20 years old. To put it mildly, I was very pleased with myself. I stood on the rail, holding onto one of the spars while Isaac, the helmsman, led us into the dock. I tossed the stern mooring line to the waiting loaders, and they pulled us up to the pier. Mr. Gibbs was already waiting for us with a trunk of money. Gibbs seemed unusually happy to see us. Like our arrival was a surprise, it was weird. I also wondered where Gibbs got the money. Of course, New Bedford was a hotbed of the factoring business. Essentially, a speculator bet a certain amount of money that the value of a shipment would be more than the amount he paid the owner. It was a form of insurance. That must be why Gibbs was already a hot commodity. Gibbs got half the profits. But he still put almost $1,000 in gold in my hand. That was my share. He said, "That's a lot of money for a young man." It should be. That's over a year of dangerous and grueling work. The afternoon was getting hot as I walked down the gangway with my sea bag over my shoulder. I must have looked like an Indian. The tropical sun burns a man to a brown color. We had only been away for a couple years, which was a mere trifle compared to the Pacific hunts, but for newlyweds, it was a long absence. The waiting crowd was sparse. That didn't surprise me. When a whaler goes out of commission, it's almost impossible for the homies to stay in touch. I looked around the dock for Faith. I didn't see her. I did see Faith's mom and sister, Julia. I approached them with a cheerful smile on my face and money in my pocket and asked, "Where's Faith?" That's when I noticed the stares. My mom was not one of those warm and loving moms. She was a tough woman with a serious husband. She looked me over as if evaluating me. Then she took my hand and said, "Let's go inside, Jacob. There are a few things you need to know." My old man was a whaling ship captain, so we were rich. It didn't help my trade. But I grew up in one of those mansions on County Street. As we walked from the dock, not a word was said. I thought, my God, where's Vera? I grew up with Faith Polk. She was literally the girl next door. My father was the captain of the ship Cicero, and her father was the master of the ship Charles W. Morgan. They were friends and partners in whaling. Their stately homes stood side by side on County Street, on the high ground. Most of the time it was just Vera and me. There were boys in our neighborhood, but none of them were as adventurous as my little buddy. We were about 6 years old when we started exploring the many interesting places along the Acushnet River. We would go out all day with a basket looking for duck eggs and come home all muddy. Faith was just a baby. But she was as fierce and brave as her father, who was a legend among Pacific whalers. By the time I was 10, I had a rowboat, and I'd take us around the Acushnet in search of pirate gold, hostile Indians, or any strange creatures, porcupines, beavers, or skunks. Fortunately, we never encountered any of these things, but there was excitement in trying. When we were growing up, our parents made sure we learned to read, count, and do math. They even talked about me going to New Haven for college. But it killed Faith and me to sit in a one-room schoolhouse when there were new adventures ahead. So more often than not, we disappeared into Clark's Cove and didn't come back until after dinner. When we hit puberty, a drastic change took place. By the time I was 14, I was ready for my first journey, big, strong, and able to do a man's job. Faith had changed too. As a child, she had been as thin and strong as a fox. Now she was a fox with a gimmick that swelled as wide and full as the mainsail of a whaling brig. We had a small group of friends. New Bedford wasn't Boston. But Faith and I were part of what was considered society there. So we attended various social gatherings and cotillions. It was just to learn the basics of adult life, nothing vulgar. That all changed when the sap started to rise. Suddenly, my little buddy had admirers. Faith was naturally shy, and the newfound male attention made her uncomfortable. So she clung to me even tighter. None of the other boys would mess with me. I was bigger than most of their fathers. So I became Faith's protector, and eventually her lover. It was after my second voyage. I was 17, almost 18, when I went whale hunting. It was on Faith's father's ship, the Charles W. Morgan. They are called right whales because they are easy to hunt and they get a lot of oil out of them. It was a short voyage, only 5 months in the Bay of Fundy. I was then a deck sailor, living in a foxtail, pulling the oar of a whaling ship and doing all the chores. For the whole voyage I made $35, but that's how I learned to run a ship. Faith was waiting on the dock when we docked. I assumed she'd come to see her father. I was amazed at how much my little friend had changed. She used to have a round, snotty face with huge, wide-set blue eyes and long blonde pigtails. Now that face had lengthened into a model of beauty. Beautiful high cheekbones, a straight nose, a sharp chin, and full kissable lips. Faith was wearing a light linen dress. It was hot, and she was sweating, so it was tight. When we landed, she rushed past her father and threw herself into my arms. I grabbed her and hugged her, surprised. She said, "Oh, Jacob, I missed you so much." And this in front of her father and the other men who cast glances at her. After all, we'd been at sea for almost 6 months, and a fock was no place to be bullied. I looked into her face and she cried. I said, "I love you, Faith." I didn't plan it. I just blurted it out. But I knew it was true as soon as I said it. She said, "I love you too," and we kissed. It gave me 5 minutes of male grief, but it was worth it, for from that moment it never occurred to us that we would not be married. The marriage was solemnized at Grace Episcopal Church on the 12th day of May in the year of the Lord, 1857. We were both 18 years old. New Bedford wasn't as puritanical as the neighborhoods around Boston, but that didn't mean we were allowed to go beyond the occasional hug. Those restrictions were set aside as soon as we said yes. Our parents were rich, so they put us up in a little cottage in Acushnet Heights. It was a nice 3-room cottage with a big stone fireplace and a beautiful porch. The sea breeze was refreshing as we sat in the rocking chair. On our wedding night, I returned from a nightcap and found my new wife in a flannel nightgown, pillows tucked under her back. Moonlight through the window illuminated the sleek brass bed. It was a wedding gift from my grandparents. She looked at me timidly as I prepared for the feast. I might have been a boatman's apprentice and a wizard with a harpoon, but I was as nervous as she was. For 2/3 of our lives, we were almost exclusively companions, but this was by far our finest moment. We had kissed before that, of course, but they were light displays of affection. We both realized that today's event was something completely different, and neither of us was experienced enough to even know how to make the first move. Faith was lying on her back, staring at me with a tinge of fear in her eyes. I lowered my face to her lush lips. The spark flared instantly. The closeness we'd shared as children brought a surge of confidence. I just looked at my new wife in amazement, just like you, my dear viewer, can listen, with your amazement, to the full version of this story on our Patreon, because I had to my regret, cut part of this scene due to some YouTube rules. Humans have a few basic instincts, and I needed one of them right now, so I just acted. After all the sounds died down, we lay there, exhausted. Eventually, I regained my sanity to look at her sweet face. She was looking at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. I think she was worried that her animalistic behavior would somehow alienate me. I looked her straight in the eyes and said in a voice filled with emotion, "We've loved each other since we've been messing around in Acushnet. That just seals the deal. You're mine forever." A jubilant expression appeared on her face and she replied, "That's all I've ever wanted, my love." Over the years, I have remembered the short period after our wedding as the best days of my life. Everything existed in a cozy haze of companionship, love, and passion. But whaling was in my blood, so I knew that sooner or later, I would have to go back to sea. Faith didn't want me to leave. She kept urging me to take a job as a digger in her father's office. Her father, Jedediah Polk, had 3 ships and a thriving whale oil business. I could make more money as a broker, and that would allow me to stay ashore. But that wasn't an option. I was young, and a sleigh ride to Nantucket was impossible to pass up. I'll be gone for a few years, and so my decision to go whaling caused my wife some resentment, which puzzled me. She had grown up in New Bedford and should have known what it was like to be married to a whaler. I said, "Look, Faith, your parents have been together for almost 30 years, and they're happy, even though your father has been on 3-year business trips the whole time." She looked at me skeptically. Then I added, trying to reassure her, "You'll be well taken care of, and it won't be forever. I'm saving up to buy my own crew, and we can live off the income from other people's work. You'll just have to be patient for a few more years." She looked at me pleadingly and said, "I want a husband, not the skipper of a whaling ship." I appreciated her words. Faith had always been energetic and adventurous, but she needed me like a fish in water. I turned to the practical side of it. I said, "We can travel together when I have my own ship. Then we will be able to see and do what we have always dreamed of. This is the beginning of the great adventure we have always dreamed of." She asked warily, "When will it be?" I replied seriously, "No more than 3 flights if they are successful. Maybe 6 to 8 years." Faith looked defeated, almost frightened. I should have realized. In a way, she loved me too much. That period of time must have seemed like a hopeless eternity to her, especially when she was so young. Hunting a 60-foot creature is a dangerous endeavor. Yet we had both grown up in New Bedford, and whaling trips were as much a part of our world as eating, sleeping, and going to church. So there was no arguing. Faith just accepted that I was going hunting, because that was what men in whaling cultures did. Thus, I enlisted on the ship Ansel Gibbs as a bosun. The offer of the bosun's position helped me make my decision. I wanted to become a captain like my father, and this was a decisive step forward. I was only 18, and I became the youngest harpooner in the whole town and a rising star in whaling. Boys my age envied me hungrily. On my first 2 voyages, I worked with Jimmy Fawkes. On the Gibbs, he was also assigned as mate. He was a buddy when it came to ship's routine, but he was lazy and unhealthy from birth, so he would never be more than a sailor. He said, "We could be without a couple of years. What are you going to do with your pretty wife?" I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He laughed and said, "She's the most beautiful woman in the whole town. You don't think the other guys won't call once you're out of sight, do you?" I gave him a hard look and said, "It doesn't matter. Faith won't give them the time of day. She loves me. So shut up, or you'll get the same thing I'll give to any guy who messes with her." But he was right. There were a lot of slick businessmen in New Bedford, many of them the same age as Jimmy and me. I knew any one of them would have given an eye for Faith, but the hint that any of them might lead her astray made me furious. Wives waited for their husbands. It was their duty. The hunt was in an area between the Falklands and the South Sandwich Islands. We stopped at Stanley in the East Falklands where we had heard about the open ocean population. When we entered the harbor, there was a Concorde loaded with oil from the hunt. On their advice, we harvested 9 huge beasts in just a few months. The hunts themselves were dangerous. You are in an open 30-foot rowboat, and you have to get within 20 yards of a whale in order to harpoon it. Then you have to wrestle with a 70-ton creature that doesn't take much pity on your attempts to end its life. But we had experienced hands, and we knew what we had to do to survive. In fact, the only real threat was on the way out. We got caught in a hurricane as we were passing east of Hatteras. We didn't know it at the time, but the ferocity of this hurricane was the talk of the entire East Coast. It was particularly strong, with killer winds. Many ships were lost. We would have been among them if it hadn't been for a little luck. We managed to duck to the west, leeward, and pass through inlet into Pamlico Sound. We would have all drowned if we had been a little farther north at the shoals off Cape Hatteras. Beyond the barrier islands, the wind eased, and we were able to make our way to Ocracoke. Most men would have insisted on not following their mother but hurrying home to their bride. But the thought never crossed my mind. People did what their mother told them to do. She was bossy. We walked silently up the hill toward County Street. Mother paced grimly beside us. Julia seemed to be crying. I began to worry. Where was Faith? We entered the parlor. I knew immediately that something auspicious was coming. The only time we used the parlor was for weddings and funerals. Mom sat me down in one of her ghastly carved wooden armchairs, and she and Julia sat across the hall on her horrible horsehair couch. Julia clasped her hands together painfully. The mother began without preamble. She said, "We have been informed that Gibbs's ship was lost in the hurricane of '57. I said, "Then I can see why the town was surprised to see us." The mother looked sinister. She said with contempt in her voice, "It was Esau Briggs who brought us the news. He said he heard about it in Baltimore." Briggs was one of our old acquaintances. His father was an oil speculator and investor. Briggs Jr. traveled up and down the coast, buying up options on the proceeds of the voyages. I said, "He was almost right. We experienced that in Ocracoke, but it was almost a fluent experience." And then it hit me. I asked, "Are you really upset about this news?" Mom looked even gloomier, if that's even possible. She said, "Most of us are used to it. We've been through it before. Your fiancé, on the other hand, has not." She added even more ominously, "That news almost killed Faith. We told her it was just a rumor, and nothing could be said for sure until you got back. But she couldn't be consoled." My mother stopped and looked at me almost with pity. Then she continued with fury in her voice. Esau Briggs devoted all his time to soothing her. Julia burst into tears. I was at a loss for words. I said, "Did Briggs comfort Faith?" And then it hit me, "No, this can't be happening." The mother said with intense anger, "It's not easy for me to tell you this, son, but Vera died in childbirth 2 months ago. It was the shame that killed her." It took a moment. Catastrophic news is like that. The implications take time to seep into your brain. Mom saw my face. She added hastily, "Briggs is in France. You'll never find him. Everyone knew you wouldn't leave him alone." Then she looked at him sternly and said, "I don't need to tell you that this is God's judgment, so accept it." And added in a kinder tone, "Faith is buried in the Congregational was clearly a madam, entered with a couple of black-clad porters carrying buckets of water. They began pouring hot water into the tub, and I recognized the feel of boiled lobster. The lady was getting ready while the two men were doing it. I wondered how a woman could do this with 3 men in the room, but it seemed that the 2 porters were invisible to her, as they were undoubtedly slaves. The woman looked at me greedily. She was about 40 years old, but she was the sweetest woman I had ever seen. I admired her. I thought she looked chubby in the dress. Much to my dismay, because of YouTube, I had to cut that part out, but I remind you that you can listen to the full version with a 7-day free subscription in our exclusive community on Patreon. A sight like her was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, especially since I hadn't been with a woman in over 2 years. So it's understandable what happened to me next. Coming to my senses, I turned and looked at her. She was lying on her back and whimpering, one hand over her eyes. She opened one eye and looked at me in surprise. Then she got up, kissed me, and said, "That was epic." I was amazed. I knew that for them it was business, not pleasure, and they certainly don't kiss. I rolled over onto my stomach, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. She said hoarsely, "Where did you get those muscles, darling? I've never been with a man with a back, shoulders, and arms like yours." I said nonchalantly, "I've been a whaler all my life. That's what you become if you're good with a paddle and a harpoon." She replied coquettishly, "What's a whaler to do in New Orleans? We don't have whales here." I said, "I was transported on a slave ship that tried to get past the patrols on Lake Pontchartrain last night. They still import slaves from Africa, you know, even though it's outlawed." I heard a grim voice say, "I know. If that double-headed eagle is from the slave trade, I don't want it." I laughed and said, "On the contrary, they needed to evade paying taxes, so they threw me and a few others ashore, along with the men they had kidnapped. I dropped them off at Bayou Sauvage, and they were on their way to the fugitive settlement when I last saw them." She gave me a dazzling smile. I grinned and said, "I imagine John Quincy Adams is looking for me at the moment." She looked at me incredulously. "Do you seriously mean to say that the great abolitionist was the captain of a slave ship?" I laughed and said, "I don't think that's his real name, but if he finds me, I'll forfeit my life." She said, "You can stay here as long as you want, my handsome boy. Perhaps I will find a use for you." Into the eyes of a sperm whale. He was taller than I was, over 6'2", and must have weighed about 280. He was completely bald, with a beard that looked like a bushy head of hair slid down to his chin. He had wicked piggy eyes and was missing an ear, which could have been due to a scar across his face. He wore a tattered captain's coat with a swallowtail, and smelled like a bilge after a long voyage in the tropics. He laughed unpleasantly and said, "Welcome aboard, sailor. I wanted to introduce myself." I wiped the blood from my mouth and asked incredulously, "Who are you, and what the hell am I doing here?" The giant laughed, made an ironic bow and said, "John Quincy Adams at your service, and you've just joined the triangle trade." The obnoxious guy in front of me was clearly not the 7th President of the United States, but I got the joke. John Quincy Adams was nicknamed the Abolitionist, and the triangle trade was still going strong, even though it had been banned in England and America for more than half a century. Cotton and rum went from the United States to England, cloth, arms, and trinkets went to Africa, and slaves were shipped to the United States. But if successful, one could get extremely rich. Of course, the profits went to all the owners. No one in their right mind wanted to take a slave on board. The only thing a crewman got was regular beatings or hanging on a yoke if caught. I was just lucky they found me passed out when they were looking for someone to kidnap. The captain said, "You're a sailor. What do you do?" I said, "None of your business," for which I got another punch in the mouth. I reluctantly said, "I was a navigator." He looked at me skeptically and said, "You're too young to be doing this, aren't you?" I angrily replied, "I don't care what you think. My wife is dead, and I'm going to join her." Adams took on a beatific expression, chuckled, and said sardonically, "I can help you with that." So I became XO on the good ship Princeton College. It was so named because Adams claimed to have been a student there. Perhaps he was. He was a very smart man, except he was also creepier than a bell tower full of bats. He could quote Latin phrases, or at least I think it was Latin. I spoke almost no English, so foreign languages were beyond me. But when it came to humanity, he was a total dunce. Adams hated everyone. The ship I was on was a 90-foot brig with square rigging and weighing 207 tons. The crew was 20 men, which was dangerously small for a ship of that size, and I was one of the few experienced sailors. So in good or bad weather, I was the one who was sent to the upper deck to pull the sail on the topgallant. It was the most dangerous job on the ship. The swaying of the mast increased there, and the deck was far below. I was chained up while we were loading and unloading at Plymouth. It was below deck where the African cargo was stored. I was bound to another unfortunate man. He too had joined the crew by kidnapping, only he was a landman whom they dragged off the pier on the Chesapeake while they were loading tobacco. The manatees kept us from jumping ship. They had plenty of them, given the ship's true purpose. We did become friends. I suppose it was a brotherhood of suffering. We were in the same boat, both literally and figuratively. We talked for hours in the darkness of the hold. His name was Springfield, and he called himself a preacher, which meant he had no useful skills. But he could read and hold an intelligent conversation. He had never had a woman in his life. Being frail and poor was not the best way to attract a girlfriend, so he was very interested in my situation. I told him about Vera and her betrayal. He said, "But your wife thought you were dead, didn't she? If you were dead, she would no longer be bound by marriage vows." That was very hurtful. I wanted Faith's act to be deliberately immoral, not the result of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Springfield asked, puzzled, "Do you think this guy made that story up?" I was sure the vile son of a bitch had fabricated it. Every young man in New Bedford wanted to stick his hand out to Faith. But unfortunately, there was hard evidence to the contrary, because we'd almost crashed. I don't know if it made me feel better or worse that Briggs's lies were based on truth. Briggs was always drooling over Faith, just like the rest of the New Bedford boys. She was far from the prettiest girl in our social circle. I smiled bitterly and said, "No, there was truth in that." I added, "Remember that big storm that came through the coast a couple years ago?" He nodded and said, "Yeah, I was lucky I was spreading the word in Fredericksburg. Otherwise, the eastern shore was nearly blown away." I said, "My ship was hit. We made it to safe harbor, but many others didn't." Springfield said, "So your wife wasn't so unfaithful in assuming you were lost at sea?" I nodded miserably. I knew Briggs was a snake in the grass, but Faith always saw the best in people. She'd be easy prey for his seduction, especially if she thought I was dead. I'd be lost if the situation was reversed. I said, "No, she wasn't, but she still had no right to let that reptile into her house." Springfield said, "Maybe she was just looking for another man. You know how women are. They want a man who will take care of them." That was the conventional wisdom in those days, but I wasn't sure that was the case with Vera. My wife was very energetic, but I knew that she tended to think with her heart, not her brain. I also knew that she truly loved me and would need a lot of comforting. That's if I was really dead. Briggs must have used that. Springfield said, "Whatever the reason, you cannot blame yourself. A man must be true to his nature. A sailor must go to sea. But there is nothing wrong in your wife's act either. She could have mourned you a little longer, but she actually thought she was a widow." I said angrily, "But I wasn't dead. She just didn't listen to other women. Faith was always a pig as soon as she got something on her mind. They all told her to wait." The vision of Faith squirming with that bastard haunted me at night. Springfield said, "What did you do with that guy Briggs?" I said, "Unfortunately, nothing. His father hid it in Europe so that it would be out of my reach. Of course, the scandal of what he did to my wife probably had something to do with his desire to leave town. I vowed that someday I would find him and settle accounts with him." After that, my reality consisted of 2 seconds of the past and 1 second of the future. That's all I could think about. Even stranger, I was completely devoid of emotion. I knew I should feel something, but it was as if all the reactions had been boiled out of me, like we boil oil out of a whale. There was nothing left, no fear, no sorrow, no remorse, no feelings. I was an empty man. My soul had shrunk to a husk. It is said that the opposite of love is not hate. It's total indifference. That's how I felt about life. That's how I seemed brave to others. I was willing to do anything dangerous because I just didn't care. The voyage to the Guinea coast and back by the middle route was a living hell. First, I had to endure the sight of 38 poor souls being driven into our boats by their own countrymen to be chained down below in the hot hold. I understood that slavery was the foundation of the Southern way of life, and I believe that if you are going to buy and sell another human being, you must have a hard-hearted mindset. But still, the inhumanity of it was beyond my comprehension. That is, until I witnessed it. It certainly sounds naive, but you have to understand. I grew up in New Bedford, where the only people of color were Indians. I knew some black whalers. They were some of the best harpooners and boatmen on the crew. And believe me, skin color doesn't matter when you're fighting something twice as big as your boat. So the sight of people like my former comrades being loaded into our hold like animals horrified me. A few braver souls, including myself, tried to improve their situation a little. Whenever possible, we smuggled fresh water and food to them. But there was nothing we could do about the situation, except endure along with them. You may reproach me for not doing more, but I was as much a prisoner on that ship as the Africans. Adams had 6 guards, all as brutal as himself. They were all armed, and any infraction carried punishment. Adams even ended the life of one man for quoting St. Paul about slavery. It was black as pitch, hot and humid as we glided along the Louisiana coast. I was the helmsman, as I was one of the few experienced helmsmen. Hot lightning illuminated heavy clouds in the northwest as we passed through the Straits of Rigolets. It was an ominous omen. I heard Adams tell his compatriots that we would drop our cargo, in his words, at Mandeville on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. I supposed the slave traders would meet us there. It was 30 miles in a straight line across the lake from New Orleans. New Orleans was home to the largest slave market in the United States. But since the importation of slaves from West Africa had been banned in 1808, we certainly could not dock on the Mississippi side of the Mississippi and begin unloading. The people of New Orleans might have welcomed us, but the authorities would have imprisoned us. We fumbled our way in the dark as we crossed the strait. It wasn't an easy time. The Navy patrolled Pontchartrain with armed boats specifically designed to catch smugglers. And although the Princeton College was built for speed, it was a sailing brig. There was no way we could outrun the steamer. We had just passed beyond the tip of Treasure Island into the open lake when we saw running lights from the direction of Chief Mentor Pass and Fort Macomb to the southeast of us. The only reason for the ship to be out at this time of day is to patrol the lake. The boat was traveling along the southeastern shore, and if we continue on the same course we're on now, they'll catch up with us sooner rather than later. I wanted Adams caught, but we were all in deep shit if we got boarded. We picked up the pilot at the entrance to the Rigolets. He had come all the way on oars from somewhere off the shore of Lake St. Catherine. He was a lanky French Creole with a heavy Cajun accent, and he knew more about the neighboring swamps than half the alligators. He whispered, "Tough guy. We can hide in Irish Bayou, yeah." I spun the wheel without consulting Adams. I saw that we'd have to crawl tangentially, off the patrol boat's course. We would have made it too, but some fool on the foredeck was smoking a pipe. He must have been nervous, or maybe he wanted us to get caught. It was only a sulfur match, but it flashed like a beacon in the blackness of that wet night. We held our breath, waiting to find out if he had been seen. The answer came almost immediately. I heard the rumble of the locomotive increase, and the running lights turned toward us. We were just passing Irish Point, and could have hidden in the cove there. But Adams and his guards were in a panic. They hastily gathered their thoughts and devised a plan to load all the contraband onto the ship's whaler, and then sail it back to Baja Sauvage. He could not be hanged if there was nothing incriminating on board. Adams knew I'd pulled the harpoon paddle, so I was the first one he threw overboard. He also threw out the Creole pilot and Springfield, who was practically useless. Then they sailed away, leaving us to deal with a bayou full of alligators, water moccasins, and all sorts of other poisonous nastiness. We had 28 frightened blacks as passengers. In the beginning, there were 38, but 10 died during the journey. That was the usual consequence of being ripped out of your life and then shoved into a monstrously hot and unsanitary room for a few days. So Adams had other things on his mind if he thought I was just going to give him these people back to sell. A few of the captives spoke French, and our Cajun guide eventually calmed them down to the point where we could do some planning. The pilot, so named Delphine, had the same attitude towards slavery as I did. According to him, Bayou Sauvage was full of communities of runaway slaves, so he suggested we take our passengers to a place where they would never be found. So I landed 28 refugees and himself on a hummock with a trail leading back to the bayou. There they could try to rebuild their lives. To my amazement, Springfield joined them. He said he saw the hand of God in the matter and wanted to tell them about it. All I saw was darkness and snakes, but I wished them well. The group disappeared into the night, chattering in their strange language. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I thought I caught a note of hope in their voices. As I paddled in the fog along the shore, the sun rose over the lake. The atmosphere was humid, unlike anything I had encountered in New England. The terrain changed from swamps to farmland. There was still no sign of New Orleans, however. I maneuvered along the coast, looking for a logical place to land. Finally, I came across what looked like a river leading southwest from the lake. There must have been a town at the end of it. This waterway was actually a canal. It had been dug by the French before Jefferson bought the place, 50 years ago. My whaleboat didn't stand out in any way, because even at this early hour there were commercial ships, barges, and other small boats on the waterway. I easily joined the stream heading south. When I got to the end of the canal, there was a turn. I tied up the boat and followed the dusty road. The road quickly changed to cobblestones and had a name, Canal Street. It seemed appropriate. I had finally reached New Orleans. I decided I was going to drive my stake into the ground right there on the spot. There was nothing at home but bad memories. I was wearing the same baggy sailor pants I'd worn when I'd been kidnapped. They had a hidden pocket right next to my family jewelry. This location ensures that you will instantly know of any attempt to take your valuables. You can't trust anyone on the Foca. That's why every sailor has something like this. Fortunately, I had stashed some gold there from my last voyage, before I even knew about the fate. So the whole time I was in Adams's clutches, I had a relative wealth with me. It gave me a chilling thought. By now, Adams had no doubt guessed I wasn't coming back, and he must have guessed I was in New Orleans. Consequently, it was likely that he would scour the city for me, so it seemed appropriate for me to lay low. It was the middle of the day, and I was walking through a place with very peculiar architecture, all those Frenchy balconies and wrought iron fancies. There were narrow streets and nooks and crannies. You could find a good hiding place in them. Logically, the place was called the French Quarter, and it seemed to be one of the older parts of the city. I was wandering down Dauphin Street, right on the edge of the Storyville neighborhood, when I saw a sign on a solid planked stone building in an alley. Men were coming in and out of the front door. Naturally, I assumed it was an inn. I mean, of course it looked like an inn. I needed a good night's sleep and a bath, so I went inside to book a room. As soon as I walked through the door, I realized my mistake. There were beautiful women scattered on the plush furniture like street cats. My first impulse was to avert my eyes. That's what we'd been taught in all those cotillions. But still, the endless abundance of legs in fishnet stockings was too much for my 20-year-old sensibilities. So I just stood there with my mouth open. You might think I'm a naive fool who came to a vacation spot looking for a bed and bath. But this place was unlike anything I had ever encountered. New England was still under the rule of its Puritan forefathers, and such places were kept secret so as not to offend the eyes of the pious. The woman broke away from her business and sailed majestically over him like a clipper ship entering the harbor under full sail. She was older than the collection of girls around her, but she must have been a stunning beauty in her day. She was wearing makeup like the main float in a 4th of July parade, but underneath all that makeup she had a very pretty face. At 6'2", I towered over her by a full foot, but I was intimidated by her confidence. She stood there sizing me up like she was buying a horse. I almost expected her to tap me on the chest and open her mouth to count my teeth. Finally, she said, "What are you all doing here, sweeties?" A gleam appeared in her eyes. I regained my sanity to stammer, "I was just looking for a BB bed and a BB bath." She chirped merrily and purred, "That'll cost you $20 in gold, sailor." I said in amazement, "That's a lot of money for a room." She laughed her strange laugh, which reeked of pure lust, and said, "We provide a small room together with a bed and hot water, mon cher." I said yes. Then she turned to the pretty, swarthy girl who crouched beside her and said, "Marie-Aimée, would you take this Yankee up to his room and give him a bath?" The new woman was slender, with long, gorgeous legs and sleek hair the color of a crow's wing. But the real wonder was her face. She was a rare exotic beauty with huge dark eyes, perfectly proportioned facial features, and a good figure. One would have to be stone cold not to react to her presence. I inhaled her musky scent. She smelled like magnolias. She moved with the easy feline grace of a jungle hunting cat, natural and fluid, yet purposeful. She was almost trotting. She opened the door to the room and led me inside. Right in the middle of the room was a large galvanized tin bathtub. I nervously asked, "So you work here?" I still couldn't get my head around the fact that an amazingly beautiful woman like this could work in a place like this. She threw me a pitying look, as if she couldn't believe I was allowed to walk around without a keeper. She said in a soft voice with a Cajun accent, "That's life. Now lie down in that tub, Cher. We'll get you some hot water and soap." I was a little embarrassed in front of the lady. Besides, I wanted to make sure that my stash of gold coins would stay with me. So I waited until the stunning creature slipped out of the room. Then I stuffed everything under the mattress. I was sitting in the tub in my birthday suit when the first woman, who was clearly a madam, entered with a couple of black-clad porters carrying buckets of water. They began pouring hot water into the tub, and I recognized the feel of boiled lobster. The lady was getting ready while the two men were doing it. I wondered how a woman could do this with 3 men in the room, but it seemed that the 2 porters were invisible to her, as they were undoubtedly slaves. The woman looked at me greedily. She was about 40 years old, but she was the sweetest woman I had ever seen. I admired her. I thought she looked chubby in the dress. Much to my dismay, because of YouTube, I had to cut that part out, but I remind you that you can listen to the full version with a 7-day free subscription in our exclusive community on Patreon. A sight like her was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, especially since I hadn't been with a woman in over 2 years. So it's understandable what happened to me next. Coming to my senses, I turned and looked at her. She was lying on her back and whimpering, one hand over her eyes. She opened one eye and looked at me in surprise. Then she got up, kissed me and said, "That was epic." I was amazed. I knew that for them it was business, not pleasure, and they certainly don't kiss. I rolled over onto my stomach, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. She said hoarsely, "Where did you get those muscles, darling? I've never been with a man with a back, shoulders, and arms like yours." I said nonchalantly, "I've been a whaler all my life. That's what you become if you're good with a paddle and a harpoon." She replied coquettishly, "What's a whaler to do in New Orleans? We don't have whales here." I said, "I was transported on a slave ship that tried to get past the patrols on Lake Pontchartrain last night. They still import slaves from Africa, you know, even though it's outlawed." I heard a grim voice say, "I know. If that double-headed eagle is from the slave trade, I don't want it." I laughed and said, "On the contrary, they needed to evade paying taxes, so they threw me and a few others ashore along with the men they had kidnapped. I dropped them off at Bayou Sauvage, and they were on their way to the fugitive settlement when I last saw them." She gave me a dazzling smile. I grinned and said, "I imagine John Quincy Adams is looking for me at the moment." She looked at me incredulously. "Do you seriously mean to say that the great abolitionist was the captain of a slave ship?" I laughed and said, "I don't think that's his real name, but if he finds me, I'll forfeit my life." She said, "You can stay here as long as you want, my handsome boy. Perhaps I will find a use for you." Wow, what a whirlwind of emotions, isn't it? From the idyllic setting of a coastal city to the harsh reality of the high seas, we are immersed in a world of contrasts and complexity. Our main character, a young and ambitious sailor, finds his world turned upside down due to a series of tragic events. The loss of his beloved wife, coupled with the betrayal of a trusted friend, leaves him adrift in a sea of despair. However, fate prepared a cruel twist when he found himself in the sinister world of the slave trade. It is a story of resilience, survival, and the ability of the human spirit to endure unimaginable hardships. This is a story about love, loss, and the complexities of human relationships. But this is just the beginning. The journey is far from over. Our protagonist is caught in a web of deceit and danger, and the stakes are higher than ever. Will he find redemption? Will he seek revenge? Or will the darkness consume him completely? Stay tuned for the next part of this epic saga, where the true depths of human depravity will be revealed. And remember, for those who want a deeper dive into this harsh world, an unformatted version awaits on our Patreon. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What theories do you have about what lies ahead? Who can our main character trust? And how will he navigate this treacherous world? Until next time, keep exploring.